sticks, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is political and policy analyst Kristen Matheny. Hey, Kristen, how you doing?
You.
I am doing okay. You know, it's interesting. Every week goes by, and Monday or Tuesday, I think, gee, it's kind of a slow week. And then the next thing I know, it's like, oh my gosh, how are we going to fit in everything we need to fit in? It never fails. I should learn by now. But we do have another pretty busy week, a lot of stuff to talk about. And, you know, I thought maybe the thing we should start with is on Thursday, the Senate voted 59-41 to rescind President Trump's national emergency declaration. And in that vote, 12 Republicans joined all 47 Senate Democrats opposing it. And of course, that follows that similar vote in the House, and that margin was 245-182, but only 13 House Republicans voted against the emergency there. And President Trump, of course, to nobody's surprise, vetoed this. And given the fact that neither chamber passed it with a two-thirds majority, I'd say it's pretty certain that this veto won't be overridden. So I think that kind of brings us up to date on this. What do you make of the vote, Kristen?
Well, you know, I think that when it comes to, you know, President Trump, and I've said this before on the show, everything he does is with an eye on re-election. I don't think that's any different from any other candidate. You know, I've made no secret about the fact that I feel that way. And I think that he is definitely thinking about his campaign promises, again, as I've said. I think that he is looking to 2020. I think he knows that if he doesn't make headway on this, and if that wall doesn't get constructed, or at least is on the way to being constructed, I think he knows, and I think most of us Republicans know, that his chances for re-election go down. I don't think they're completely lost, but I think they go down significantly, if I'm just being honest. So I think that, you know, the veto, it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. I fully expected it to happen. I think most pundits fully expected it to happen. And also the fact that it was voted down in the Senate doesn't surprise me one bit either. I think, and, you know, I am surprised by a couple of the Republicans who, you know, turned on declaring the emergency vote. You've got people like Senator Rand Paul. Marco Rubio surprised me. I'm a Floridian. That one surprised me a little bit. I thought he would stand with the president on that. Yeah.
Well, you know, it seems to me that most of the Republicans who voted against it weren't voting against it because they are anti-wall, but it was
Right.
more a question of executive overreach. And so in that sense, I mean, someone like a Rand Paul, that totally makes sense. And Mike Lee, of course, is in that camp as well, and some others. And so I think it put Republicans in a difficult spot because, of course, many congressional Republicans had spent the 8 years previous to the Trump presidency railing against executive overreach, but it's a lot harder to rail against executive overreach when it's a president in your own party. And, you know, I think a lot of people would say, well, he's a really unpopular president, but not among Republicans, you know? I mean, even so, you look at, you know, 42, 41% overall favorability, but in the Republican Party, he's still, I think they're in the 80s and so, you know, going against him is a pretty rough thing. And I think there was only one Republican who's up for re-election next time, that's Susan Collins, who actually voted for the resolution. And I think that says a lot. I think, you know, it's not just President Trump who's eyeing re-election here.
Right. And, you know, it's funny. I've talked to a lot of fellow Republicans. I personally tend to side with Rand Paul on a lot of issues. And the issue of this executive overreach and, you know, during the Obama administration was a really big issue. And like you mentioned, for 8 years, you know, we Republicans railed against this. And Rand Paul was one of the loudest voices, as was Mike Lee. And this doesn't surprise me. I tend to, you know, I think when I heard about Rand Paul making the vote he did, I kind of said, oh man, you know, I thought that maybe he would come through, but it doesn't surprise me that he didn't. I think he makes some very valid points about executive overreach and declaring emergency in a situation like this. But I also think that, you know, these senators aren't stupid. They knew that the president would veto this. You know, whether or not that comes into play, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and it probably, it seems to me that it probably won't come into play, and that there aren't the votes to override it. But it's possible, and some have suggested it's possible that Congress's majority vote against this may at least come into, in part, the federal court's deliberations as to the intent of Congress and what the president's done, and whether or not this was a way to get around congressional intent and sort of usurp Congress's spending authority and so forth. I don't know, how much of a role that would play, but certainly this isn't the kind of thing that helps the president in the court battles that are sure to come.
Right. You know, he's definitely stacked the courts in his favor up until now. And I think that, resting too much on his laurels at this point, thinking that this is going to be court battle after court battle. I mean, obviously, you've got, more liberal circuits who will, hold him off at every pass. But I think he knows that generally the courts are stacked in his favor, and that he's been a big part of making that happen. Whether or not he's taking that for granted, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think certainly the one court that matters most, obviously, is the Supreme Court, to which he's already appointed 2 justices. But it seems to me that on these sort of matters, the justice that I'm most interested in, I think will be the most interesting to watch when it gets to this point, will be Justice Roberts.
Robert.
Yeah, exactly. And I would not at all be surprised to see a 5-4 vote against the president with Roberts on the majority side against President Trump. He's disappointed conservatives a lot in the past, and one of the things I really like about Justice Roberts, even though in terms of judicial philosophy he and I don't disagree, it seems to me that he's not the sort of person who first finds his preferred outcome and then sort of crafts his judicial philosophy to get to that end, at least not as much as some justices. And I can at least respect that in kind of the same way that I can respect Rand Paul and Mike Lee, even though in terms of policy, we're just miles and miles apart.
Right. Yeah, I actually was just talking to my husband the other night about this, and I said the same thing. I'm always interested to see what Roberts has to say. And again, for the same reason that you, as, a more liberal American, would look to him, and you may disagree with him in terms of ideology, you have respect for him. In the same way, I have respect for him as someone who has a lot of I guess animosity towards bias, especially in the court, and just bias in general. I've become pretty skeptical of everybody in Washington, and I'm skeptical of Supreme Court justices. I think a lot of them legislate from the bench, and I disagree with Roberts on a lot of his rulings. But I am also very interested to see where he falls on this issue. And I think it's a 50-50 proposition. He could really decide either way. And it also remains to be seen what's presented in front of the Supreme Court, too. There may be angles to this story that we don't know about. I mean, what's being played out in the media is awfully politicized.
Yeah, absolutely. But, one other thing that I think a lot of people on the left are sort of thinking about, or at least hoping about, I don't know, is that no matter what happens, that this can be dragged out long enough so that with any luck and, universe willing, President Trump is no longer President Trump come January of, 2021, and no wall construction would have started. And then, of course, everything can go back to more as we on the left like to think of as a more sane, better America than this 4 horrific kind of year period sort of thing. So, and I think, that there's a real good chance that happens, because given all the legal hurdles, I think it would be difficult to imagine, at least from my mind, real construction starting anytime before, 2021, really.
Oh, sure. I don't think that that's going to be happening anytime soon. We've talked on the show about the fact that you've got a lot of private land, and that wall would need to be on private land, and there are, of course, issues there. It's going to be a mess of legal headache after headache. And it's going to, either way, no matter which side of, the wall argument you fall on, it's going to be a long process, and it's going to be a major, I guess, a major calling card for each side during 2020. So, I expect nothing but ramping up of this. Don't find yourself getting tired of the wall conversation, because it's about to continue and it's about to ramp up. That's all I have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll be coming back to this a lot as it works through the courts, and once we get into campaign season in Rio, that's definitely going to be no matter how tired we might be of talking about the wall, it's awfully important, as you pointed out. So more later on that. Anyway, moving on. The U.S. Federal Aviation Administration for a long time. It's been, well, essentially kind of led the world when it comes to air travel regulation, but this week, it found itself in a unusual and I would say kind of uncomfortable position, and that's the position of following instead of leading. After that Ethiopian Airlines Boeing 737 MAX 8 crashed on Sunday, and of course that was the second one in less than 6 months. Well, China actually took the lead and on Monday grounded the plane, and then after that, almost every other country in the world did the same, and it with Canada and U.S. were the lone holdouts. And then on Wednesday, the U.S. finally joins everyone else in banning or in grounding the plane. And there are some people who say, well, hey, this probably reflects the political influence of Boeing, which it's the world's second largest defense contractor. It's a huge company. Its 2018 revenues were over $100 billion, which is an all-time high for the company. And there were a lot of people saying, well, that the CEO of Boeing was talking with Donald Trump, and maybe this is a case where the FAA was politically pressured into jeopardizing public safety for the sake of a big American company. What do you think, Kristen?
Well, I think, of course, there's something to the ties between Boeing and the government. I view it less as a political issue and more of just kind of in the larger scope as a problem that we have with, big companies being tied to the government, these problematic contracts and special interests and things like that. And I don't think, for Republicans to say this is a Democrat problem, or for Democrats to say this is a Republican problem, I think is really missing the mark. I think this is more about just a problematic relationship overall. And I don't think this is any exception. I can't really speculate as to what was going on behind the scenes, but I'd have to imagine this is the only explanation as to why. I mean, unless the FAA was saying that they wanted to run special trials, or they wanted to test the aircraft, or maybe attempt to regulate it, make it better, something like that. I can't imagine a scenario where the special interest of between Boeing and the government weren't in play here. So I mean, I think it's pretty obvious what was going on.
Well, I heard an incredibly uncomfortable interview with the head of the acting head of the FAA, and basically he was saying, well, because the reporter asked him, so why didn't you ground these things? And he said, well, we didn't have all the evidence in it. We wanted to wait and see. And so the reporter said, so what you're saying is, in absence of the evidence, you erred not on the side of caution, but on the side of just letting them fly. And he didn't really have a good answer for that, because I don't think there was a good answer for that. I think they really stepped in it on this, for one. And secondly, I think, it really demonstrates what happened around the world, demonstrates how the world has changed in the last 20, 30 years or so. I mean, China has something like a quarter of all of these Boeing 737 MAX 8 planes. So when they act in this area and in so many other areas now, they have the kind of muscle, that kind of sway that makes a lot of other countries act in concert with them. And so it's not, I think we're so used to the U.S. just having such a mighty footprint that what we do, everyone else will kind of follow along with. But, we're really starting to see that change. And I think this is a good example of that.
Yeah, it's funny because the responses from these, all of these interviews that I was reading, and all of these articles I was reading about this case, the responses from different FAA officials and different officials with the government, they were saying things sort of like we can either confirm or deny type of answers, and very, very vague, and it's the equivalent of when I was on a debate team in high school or in college or whatever, and it was sort of one of those, well, we don't have an answer, but we're going to do the research and get back to you, sort of a thing. It's just a pass along, and I don't think that there's any way around it, no matter if you favor the I guess, the argument that the FAA really was going to investigate these things. I think sometimes we just use that as an excuse, and I think this is a perfect example of that. And it just seems like kind of a pass off. And the fact that other countries were looking to China and to other places around the world for guidance on this issue is a little alarming. As somebody who believes in American exceptionalism, I think that should be a wake up call.
Yeah.
And hopefully it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And one other aspect of this is some people are wondering if this is going to hurt Boeing. I mean, their stock price took a little bit of a hit, but really they're doing just fine. And in part, it's because the large aircraft market is a really weird market because basically you've got Boeing and you've got Airbus, and it's not like going from Boeing to Airbus is, like trading in your Civic for a Corolla or something like that. I mean, there's a lot involved in building up these fleets and training pilots and so forth. And so, and of course, as someone who's very market oriented yourself, you certainly obviously appreciate when you have such a lack of competition for some understandable structural reasons. That gives these companies an awful lot of clout and an awful lot of market power that it oftentimes is not in the best interest of the consumer.
Oh, definitely. I'm not about, there's been so much talk in the media about breaking up these big companies and these big conglomerates lately. And I think that there's a fine line, between letting the free market be the free market, which I'm all about, but at the same time ensuring that, smaller companies have the opportunity to compete. But when you have a juggernaut like Boeing or Airbus or something like that, I think that these are questions we have to discuss, and I think they have to be discussed in the government. And I think it's, the source of a lot of these problems is that when you develop these comfortable relationships between these big companies and the government, and there are these lobbying relationships, and, you get politicians who are bought and paid for, there are comfortable conversations, but we have to have them. And if nothing else, this has done that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also in these cases where it's just not practical to break up big companies or to create competitors out of thin air, given the entry costs of becoming a major aircraft manufacturer, then what that means is that the only option really is to have much more careful and thoughtful regulation of these companies. I mean, that's the only way you can really get around the fact that you don't have that market competition providing that discipline. And so I think this is a case where maybe that regulation in terms of what sort of training that what should have been required for new pilots on this. And, the 737 MAX 8 was basically marketed by Boeing as being something where, hey, pilots won't have to get any really additional training or not a whole lot. And from the beginning, pilots were saying, I think we need a little more training on this. And there's some dispute as to whether or not, to the extent to which these crashes had anything to do with that. But still, I think these are questions, as you point out, that are well worth asking.
Definitely. And you say the word regulation and I kind of shudder.
Of course you do. I mean, I'd expect nothing less.
And I shudder. I generally don't like regulation, but I think sometimes when it comes to, Ronald Reagan's probably turning over in his grave, but, I think sometimes when it comes to things like public safety, I believe that the role of the government is to kind of stay out of things and sort of get out of the way. I don't like red tape, but I think when it comes to issues of public safety, legitimate concerns and issues of public safety, and I think that this falls into that category, I do think that these are questions we need to ask. I'm not saying, start signing paperwork to regulate, all of these different, large, huge conglomerate companies and these, these big corporations. But what I am saying is maybe we need to start asking questions when it concerns public safety, and I'll draw the line at public safety.
Okay, fair enough. I'll take what I can get for you. That's pro regulation.
Yeah, just that though, just that.
All right, before we get to our next story, I'd like to thank our newest Patreon monthly supporter, and that's Ben, who wrote in that he loves the show and he hopes that his contribution will help us out. So thank you, Ben. It absolutely will help us out, and we appreciate it. Of course, when you become a monthly sustaining supporter of the show through Patreon, you get more than just our our sincerely heartfelt thanks. Supporters get access to our weekly bonus show and my 12-part Nuts and Bolts of American Politics series, the last part of which I'll be posting in a few days here. And there are a bunch of other things you can get at various levels of support. So we hope you'll check that out if you haven't already. And that's at patreon.com/politics, guys. Okay, moving on to our next story. You know, this week, President Trump proposed his 2020 budget. All kinds of things going on here. It calls for $4.7 trillion. God, it's hard for me to say that. $trillion in spending, $750 billion more for defense, $8.6 billion for, you guessed it, border wall construction, 722 miles of it, and major cuts in not only just about all discretionary domestic spending, but also proposed cuts in Medicare that would total $845 billion over 10 years. And even under the administration's best case scenario, which calls for what economists say are just totally unrealistically high and sustained levels of economic growth, the plan still predicts that the national debt will increase, and it's $22 trillion, that it will increase by $4.3 trillion over the next 4 years. And it also projects that government spending just to pay the interest on the debt will be $482 billion in the next year. And that's more than the entire budget for Medicaid. It's hard for me to say some of those numbers. So what do you think about the president's budget, Kristen? I mean, first, I guess we should talk about it as a legislative document, its chances in Congress, but also, and I think maybe more importantly, what it says about President Trump's priorities.
Well, I think that the most important sort of hallmark legislation of any president's term is actually the budget. It's the thing that I look to because I think it shows the whether or not they're making good on their campaign promises. I think it's a bit of a referendum. And with something like this, you can sort of see Trump's mind. I don't want to, I don't know.
You don't want to get in there. I understand, but yeah, okay.
but I think you can sort of see the inner workings of what he's thinking, where he's going. I think obviously the two things that are most notable are the fact that you have this big bump in defense spending, and then you have this large amount of money allotted for the wall, which hasn't. I mean, these two things have never changed. The sort of two mottos or the two things that came up the most during his campaign were veterans, troops, more money for the troops. There's been this big focus on defense spending where it hasn't been, and it certainly wasn't for the 8 years prior. And then there's also obviously this issue of building a wall. And so I think that the big takeaway for me was that these are going to be the two things that are preached during the 2020 campaign. And these are also two easy things for Democrats to attack.
Yeah.
It's very easy for Democrats. I think they've already tried to pull down this narrative of building a wall, why it works, and in some ways I think they've done an effective job. I don't think they've convinced a lot of people. A lot of people just I think they just sort of shrug their shoulders, and they're willing to hear both sides, but they'll sort of shrug their shoulders and they'll either vote for him or they won't vote for him in the end. But I think that these two issues are going into 2020 are going to be the two big issues that we hear about again: the wall and defense spending. As for the deficit, I find that alarming because I think that one of the things that he also said during his 2016 campaign was that we were going to cut spending, we were going to drain the swamp, and I bought into a lot of that. And so I'm looking to see how exactly that's going to play out with this budget. As somebody who supports Trump but is very skeptical of him, I'm skeptical of this, burgeoning budget. We're talking about, increasing the budget increasing the deficit significantly. And that was a big complaint I had under Obama. So if this just continues, then that's going to be upsetting leading into 2020.
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, and this is in the context of a $1.5 trillion tax cut, which I should point out, too, that if Congress makes the individual cuts that are scheduled to expire in 2025 permanent, and that was kind of put in there under the assumption that they would, just to make the top line number look lower, that'll end up being a $2.3 trillion tax cut. So when you're bringing in that much less, even if you get some amount of greater economic growth, that still means that in order to kind of balance things out, you have to do some serious cutting. And it seems like to me, the priorities are pretty clearly, on the wall and defense and that sort of thing. But one thing I wanted to point out from the policy side on defense is kind of interesting, the budget trickery that is being proposed to get around the spending caps that were put into place by Congress in 2011. Now, in the past, getting around them basically required that the administration boost domestic spending. Democrats in Congress would say, well, okay, if you want to boost military spending, we want to see a one-to-one correspondence between that and domestic spending. And the Trump administration had gone along with that in the past, but this time they said, no, we're not going to do that. So what they did is, given the fact that the defense spending proposal is $750 billion, well, the actual defense caps this year under the 2011 law are like around $174 billion less than that. So to get around that, what they did is they're asking for way more money than even they admit is needed for what's called the Overseas Operations Contingency Fund. And that covers, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, because that pot of money doesn't count against those caps. And so, I mean, it's a totally transparent sort of shell game. So it's not much of a shell game, I guess. But I thought that was pretty interesting. But the other thing I think is interesting is, Donald Trump said he wasn't about to do anything with Medicaid, no cuts to that. And these cuts, even though he characterizes this as waste, fraud, and abuse, that's the kind of thing that, I mean, Democrats I'm loving it. I'm saying, well, that's awesome. That's a wonderful issue to campaign on. Donald Trump, I could throw the Donald Trump as candidate saying he's not going to touch this. And then all of a sudden this budget's like, that's a wonderful gift. Thank you, Donald Trump, for giving Democrats that gift for 2020. We really appreciate it. So, but also obviously as a actual budget that's going to be enacted, I mean, it's pretty much common now that presidential budgets are dead on arrival. Even when he had a Republican Congress, they said there's no way we're cutting all these domestic agencies by this much. I mean, last year it was like, well, I want to cut the EPA by a third and cut the State Department by like a third. And then there were similar cuts this year. And of course, members of Congress of both parties, for the most part, just kind of roll their eyes and say, yeah, thanks, we're going to do our own thing.
Right. I think that, like I said before, budgets often are a useful insight into what a president is thinking, and I feel like they campaign on these promises, and it's all pie in the sky, and they say these things to get elected. As somebody who's worked on, I think I counted like 14 campaigns
Wow.
as of now. It's just something you hear. You hear this from people who are running for Congress, people who are running for Senate. I've worked on a gubernatorial campaign. I've worked on a presidential campaign. You hear this a lot, and you have to kind of, you have to kind of stop yourself and say, am I really going to believe that all of this is going to get done? And then the budget comes out, and what you see is, these, people who ran for office on these promises, and all of a sudden it's like reality has hit them. They've been in the quote unquote swamp for a couple of years, and they've seen how the sausage is made. And so they realize that they have to start making these unpopular choices, and these things that may alienate their base. And I think that Medicare, Medicaid, any sort of funding for those programs or eliminating funding is going to be a losing issue for Republicans, in when it comes to voting, because I think that Democrats have sort of, run the narrative on that. And the difference is, though, I think that now you have a Republican Party that's less concerned about those issues and seems to be much more concerned about things like national security, building the wall. I mean, these are really popular issues amongst Republicans. And really the difference is here in 2020 is going to be where, your independents and your non-party affiliated people are going to be aligning themselves. Are they going to see these more, sort of these general welfare, domestic issues like Medicare funding, Medicaid funding, things like that? Are these going to be the forefront issues, or is this going to be about immigration and, defense spending? I'd argue that, what it's going to come down to is where those, those sort of middle of the road people are going to turn, what issues they see as more important. I think Donald Trump knows that.
Yeah, I totally agree with your electoral analysis of it. And I guess my concern is more and more that that's the only concern that they seem to be bringing up, and that I mean, when the interest on the debt is more than the entire Medicaid budget, that to me is it is insanely irresponsible as far as I'm concerned to essentially to put this burden on future generations, and this bill comes due with interest. I mean, this is horrifically bad policymaking. And back when I was a Republican a million years ago, there were plenty of people in the GOP who preached fiscal responsibility and really meant it, and now it seems like, and of course they would talk about Democrats as being these tax and spend Democrats, but geez, now it seems like it's like tax cut, borrow and spend Republicans, which to my mind is even worse because, I mean, this is just horrifically irresponsible, I think.
Right. And I as a Republican, I think that the idea of sort of reworking Medicare and Medicaid and being able to provide to people who really need it. I do think that the system needs a serious overhaul. But for example, this budget proposed major cuts to Social Security, and I think that Republicans have largely won that argument against Social Security. It's been a long time coming, but we need to get a better system in place, and slowly over time there have been several cuts made to Social Security, and I think people have largely sort of forgotten the issue, unless you're actually on Social Security, and then it becomes an issue, and that's something that we're going to have to contend with too. But I think when it comes to this idea of Medicare funding in this budget, it presents this big issue for 2020. And again, I think it's going to be, is this something that's going to affect those middle of the road people? I think Republicans largely will agree with Donald Trump. But, then if he gets reelected in 2020, which I know is your nightmare scenario, but if he gets reelected in 2020, what will become of Medicare? This proposed budget makes some serious cuts. I mean, Social Security, again, we've largely kind of let that go, but now what becomes of Medicare? Because that could be a serious problem for Republicans in terms of policy. So I don't know.
Absolutely. I always tell my students, old people vote, and you gotta watch for that. So yeah, absolutely. All right. Let's see. Moving on. This week we had yet another entrant into the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination contest. That's of course Beto O'Rourke, and his announcement brings the total of major candidates, at least by what I consider major candidates, up to an even dozen now. And that's, by my reckoning, 2 from the House, and I'm including O'Rourke here, 2 mayors, 2 governors, and 6, count them, 6 Democratic senators. So it's a crowded field, certainly. And, my take on O'Rourke is that he's somewhat more moderate than a lot of the other big names in the race, and I like that. And of course, he nearly beat Ted Cruz for the Senate seat in Texas, which I don't think there's any way that translates into Texas going Democratic for president in 2020. But still, it's something. But what I'm not crazy about is his lack of experience in national politics. And I'm kind of more old school here in that I still believe that being governor of a big state, ideally one where you have to work with the legislature that maybe isn't, of your party or all that willing to go along with you. I think really that's the best preparation for the presidency, though it's not like anything can actually prepare you for the presidency. And so, I've been in the Hickenlooper camp for a while now, and he's still my guy. Not just because I love to say Hickenlooper, but that is part of it a little bit. But I think there's also something to be said for Inslee as well. But I like the governors, always have. But anyway, what do you think about O'Rourke?
Oh, Robert Francis O'Rourke. Where do we begin with this guy? No, I've had a couple of conversations with Democrat friends of mine, none of who are fans of O'Rourke. My sister actually lives in Texas, and she was a Ted Cruz voter. But I remember during the O'Rourke Cruz showdown, she was telling me that she was very worried that Ted Cruz was not going to get reelected. Now she lives in Dallas, which is obviously a major urban
Right.
center, and you have a lot of voters in those major urban centers, and I think that that's what largely gave O'Rourke his power at the polls. But when he didn't win, I breathed a sigh of relief. Now, granted, I'm not the biggest Ted Cruz fan in the world. He's honestly, Ted Cruz is not the most likable candidate, and
Yeah.
as somebody who worked on campaigns, I mean, it just, I agree with a lot of what Ted Cruz has to say. He's more socially conservative than I am, though. But he's a pretty staunch constitutionalist, and I really respect that. But he's not likable, and I hate to say likability goes a long way. I don't know that Beto O'Rourke, or Robert Francis O'Rourke, whatever you choose to call him, is the most likable candidate either. He comes with some baggage. I think all politicians nowadays, especially with social media being as rampant as it is, and people going back and looking in yearbooks, and interviewing people in your second grade class, and everybody's bound to have some skeletons in their closet. But he's got some pretty big skeletons in his closet. A DUI, what was it, in 1998? And some trouble there. He also, like you mentioned, the lack of experience. I grew up with a dad who used to tell me exactly the same thing, that people with executive experience, like governors, they make the best presidents because they have this ability to lead and delegate, and they've led on this large scale. And I don't know that political experience is necessarily a prerequisite for becoming president, but I do think that somebody who has a lack of executive experience, I think that should be questioned, and he certainly doesn't have any. So I hate to say I don't take O'Rourke seriously, because I think a lot of people didn't take Donald Trump seriously, and look at what that got them. But
Sure.
I I look at him, and I struggle to take him seriously because I just don't think, like you said, he has the experience. But he is more moderate than some of the other people who have leapt breathlessly into the race. And he's entertaining to watch, if nothing else. I'm definitely not a fan of Robert Francis, but we'll see.
Well, yeah, I don't really. In fact, I kind of like the fact that he has a bit of a past. For whatever reason, the sort of robotic candidates, the people
Oh yeah.
who've been running for president since they've been 12 or something like that, and carefully building up their biography and all that kind of thing. Those people just they make me cringe, and so many people in politics seem to be like that. And the fact that he seems to be, at least to a certain extent, almost like a human being, to the extent that a national politician can be, is refreshing to me. But it is the experience thing. And again, I agree with you that just because you're a governor doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a good president. Most people aren't going to be good presidents because it's just
Right.
a hell of a tough job. But at least I think that having some success and having some experience at a lower level at least suggests that maybe you're not going to be a complete and utter disaster. So yeah, for me, until I hear compelling evidence otherwise from another candidate, I'm a Hickenlooper guy.
Oh, I'll get your Hickenlooper shirt out to you right
Yeah,
away.
that's good. I like it. All right, I think we have time for one more story today, and it's one a lot of people have been talking about. This week, federal authorities charged, I think, it was over 50 people with taking part in a nationwide college admission scam at elite schools, which it all kind of revolved around big bribes to athletic coaches as well as cheating on admissions exams. And in some cases, it's alleged that parents paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to help get their kids into these programs. Now, Education Secretary Betsy DeVos said that she's looking into whether or not any Department of Education regulations were violated, and the schools involved have put on leave or fired a number of these officials who were allegedly part of this scam. So I know, Kristen, you said that you've been hearing a lot about this and talking a lot about this. What's your take on it?
Well, I have to put it out there that I am actually a USC Trojan, so this story hits probably a little closer to home than I wanted it
One of
to.
those schools,
Um,
yeah.
yeah. I will also say that the reasons I got into USC, I'm guessing, were legitimate because I didn't pay a dime. I'm certainly paying for it now still in terms of student loans. But yeah, I've been telling people all week, don't look at me. I didn't even buy them a cup of coffee to get in, you know. But you know, as a Trojan, I mean, we haven't had a good year. There have been a lot of things happening at USC, but you know, I had a really interesting conversation. I'm a mom, and you know, my kids are going to school and living in an area that's, you know, very competitive in terms of academics. And we, you know, we were talking about at work and also, you know, with my mom friends and my dad friends about, you know, what exactly, why are these parents paying this much money to get their kids into school? And all I can say is that it's all about cachet. It's not so much that these kids are getting this education. It's about the cachet of saying that you went to Harvard, Yale, or, you know, USC, or, you know, wherever these kids are getting into. And a friend of mine actually brought up a really good, I guess, an idea for a punishment for these parents who have this money and are sort of passing this privilege on to their children, that they should actually fund scholarships for underserved kids who
Ooh,
get into these schools and can't otherwise go, instead of going to prison or having to pay fines. I thought that
very
was really,
creative. Yeah, I like it.
I thought that was brilliant, and I can't take credit for it. It was one of my closest friends who made that observation, and I thought, you know, I need to bring that up today. It was
Yeah, no,
really good.
that is good. Yeah, to me, I feel like this is obviously an awful thing, and I can see why a lot of folks would be pretty upset about it. But to me, it kind of highlights the fact that we have very much a two-tiered system. I think in most polls, people would say, well, merit should be the only thing that determines what kind of school you get into. And I understand that reasoning, certainly. But to me, you know, when people talk about merit, they almost always mean grades and test scores. But to me, the real scandal here, and this is a much harder thing to deal with, is the everyday advantages that the wealthy have in elite college admissions. I mean, you know, these super expensive test prep services and tutors, these things can cost tens of thousands of dollars. To admissions policies from these schools that give preferential treatments to legacies or to children of major donors and that sort of thing, as well as some pretty clear links that have been established between things like, for instance, financial insecurity and lower test scores. So, I mean, people who are at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, they're not competing on a level playing field, even absent just out and out cheating. And that, I think, is the bigger problem, because no matter how you look at it in terms of a fairness thing, which on the left, that's kind of how I look at it, a quality thing. But if you just from the right, though, if you look at it from well, what sort of human capital are we not developing? There's a ton of human capital that's being underdeveloped because of this essentially two-tiered system.
Right. And, you know, as somebody who was the first person in her family to go to college, I was the first person to go to college, go to grad school, graduate. You know, I think it was an uphill battle for someone like me, because it wasn't something that was put into my head at an early age, like you're going to college because your entire family went to college. And you know, and not that it wasn't encouraged, it was definitely encouraged, but I think that there were a lot of people. You know, I grew up in a community where there were a lot of haves and a lot of have-nots. I kind of fell somewhere in the middle, and you know, a lot of the haves got into these great schools not because they deserved it, but because, you know, they were legacies, a lot of legacies. And you know, I think it just goes to show that this is something that's, it's not just something that's come about in the last couple of decades. This is something that's deeply flawed within our academic system. And these, I think you hit the nail on the head with the idea of the socioeconomic divide, because, you know, a lot of people like to point fingers and say, well, it's, you know, it's about all these other things that divide us. I think the socioeconomic divide is by far the biggest thing, the biggest advantage that the haves and the have, you know, the haves have over the have-nots, I should say.
Yeah.
And I think that this, if nothing else, outlines that, and it shows that these sort of elite schools, and this is less even a political issue and just more, again, of questions we should be asking. You know, what do we do to reduce that? Is it possible to reduce the bias that some of these schools and these admission councils have against people who are legacies or people who have had these advantages? How do you erase these advantages? I don't know that you ever could, but these are questions we need to be asking.
Well, I think one way to deal with those problems specifically would be, I mean, certainly you can change education funding so that essentially anyone who gets federal student loans can apply them to a school that employs these sort of policies. So that would be a pretty
Right.
straightforward policy fix. But you know, I should point out too that while this has gone on forever, to a certain extent, it's a newer problem. I mean, obviously it's been a few years to say the least since I've been in college. But I've been around college students my entire life because I'm a professor. But when I remember when I went to take the SAT and ACT and then for grad school the GRE, I literally just signed up, and then on the day of the test, I went there and I took the test. My
Right.
test prep was zero. I mean, I spent literally no time test prepping. I just figured you just go and you take the test. And back even then, a lot of people thought that was kind of somewhat of a little bit of a lackadaisical kind of thing. You know, you go to the bookstore and buy a book and look it over. But my point is this industry has really just become a huge thing. And, you know, back 30 years ago, it was a lot more realistic for maybe some poor kid to be able to buy a test prep book. And then it was a little more equal. But now the sort of advantages and the sort of things, the sort of systems that have been developed to systematically advantage children of the elite, the system is just so bifurcated now. And that is by far the much more difficult problem, because even if you eliminate things like legacies and some of these other policies that schools have, how do you deal with that? There's not a real good way to deal with that without getting at a lot more of these core problems, which are obviously super tough to deal with.
And I think I have another very good friend who's she's more liberal leaning, but she was on a college admissions board, and she worked with kids. She still works with kids trying to get into these elite schools, and she's often told me about how problematic it is that we have, for example, kids within a certain area all attending a certain school, all getting into the same sort of elite schools, and how the idea of quotas from schools have been put in place. Like, for example, the public school where my home is zoned, the closest public school, it's in South Florida, and we have a large number of kids who go to the University of Florida, which is a very good, public university, and a lot of kids, it's sort of a feeder school for that. And they've had to really restrict the numbers of kids coming from that particular high school and going to the University of Florida. And so you've seen a lot of these kids who, quote unquote, deserve to go, so they say, not getting into places like University of Florida or more elite schools, and private schools because of these caps or these quotas. And, I think that maybe that's a step in the right direction in terms of trying to level the playing field. But then these kids will get into good schools, and not that they shouldn't get into good schools. It's not necessarily their fault that they may have worked really hard, but they also had these advantages. And if nothing else, it's got to be a conversation that we have with these schools. What are we doing to better? It starts at the very beginning of a child's education. What are we doing to sort of raise up these poor performing schools in these low income areas? What can we do to make those schools better so that these kids are set up on the right track?
Oh yeah.
And I think we're making strides, but I don't think we're nearly doing enough. And I think that's the most distressing thing of all, is how young it starts, and how these kids who go to these good schools from the very, very beginning have these advantages.
Yeah, I mean yeah, we could do definitely a whole show on that. I mean, just don't even get me started on funding public schools through local property taxes. That just drives me nuts. But that's again, I don't want to get to talk about a driver of inequality. But anyway,
an idea for a show.
Yeah, definitely, because I have some pretty strong opinions about that, and that would be great to talk about that and vouchers and a bunch of other things. So, but anyway, on that note, I think we'll wrap up. But actually, I should point out that as soon as Kristen and I are done recording this show, we're going to be doing our special supporters only exclusive bonus show. And so, if you are a supporter, that should be in your podcast app by the time you hear this. If I'm doing my job right. If you're not a supporter and you'd like to get listen to that, well, you can become a supporter by going to our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/politicsguys. Now, subscribing to the show also really helps us out, as does sharing episodes and leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes. So if you can do that, that would be really great. We would appreciate it. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Bruce Johnson, Will Moreno, and Benji Fishman. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.